Hey, Thomas, thanks for sitting down with me for the Optispan podcast. This is a real thrill. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to start by giving you at least what I would consider a tough question, which is, you've been in this space for a while, and I'm wondering, what are some of the things, we're going to see if you can come up with 5, but what are some of the things where you have kind of changed your mind about, and how did you get there?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is definites. I've changed my mind on definites, and I have definitely really come to grips with the fact that the more you learn, the less you know, and we don't know anything. And I know that's not a super sexy answer, and but it's also given me a lot of peace in some ways.
So follow on that. How do you, but I mean, as you know, right? People want simple answers. So I mean, how do you kind of try to walk that line? Because you want to give people information. And I know you were joking, but we know some things, but there's not a lot that I think we have absolute certainty on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really difficult in the content game because people are looking for that soundbite. People are looking for that little piece that they can take. And then also outside of the entertainment perspective, people are looking for a takeaway that they can apply, right? Mm-hmm, and if you come at it with nuance, they sometimes feel like you're not giving them an answer. You're just giving them a wraparound. And sometimes, unfortunately, that's kind of the case. So, I find that it's my role to distill things down as much as I can and give them something that is a pragmatic takeaway that they can apply that's certainly not going to hurt them.
Right.
But at the very least, might have a net zero effect, but will probably help them, right? And sometimes that degrades the content because you can't get that spicy little shock that you need. But what I've pivoted to doing is getting people excited about the science, getting them. So the shock and the spice has to come from what we're uncovering and what we're learning. And I try to foster that love for growth and expansion in the mind rather than a definite of how they're going to lose X% body fat in X amount of time. Right. You got to play the game. It's still YouTube. You got to dangle that carrot a little bit, but I find that it's my responsibility to kind of bridge that gap between where we got the clickbait side of things to, okay, well, here's reality.
Yeah. Do you ever go back and look at prior episodes from years ago and see there were some things that you were definite on that now you're kind of like, oh yeah, maybe.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we've taken some vids down before too, where things are just my interpretation of them was wrong or where perhaps living in an echo chamber so much in one given dietary category, it wasn't that I was incorrect, but I wasn't looking at everything, right? I wasn't looking, and it's still not looking at everything. No one has time to look at everything, right? We all have our individual sort of silos, right?
Absolutely.
And with a pretty significant low-carb bias, I tended to look at things through that lens, which is fine. And that garnered a great audience that was in the same camp as me. But then you start to feel like, is this wrong to not look at the other side too and not kind of factor it all in? And many things have still stuck from that, right? Where I'm like, okay, no, this just confirms that I really feel strongly about this. But a lot of it has just come down to the language that I use, right?
Sure.
Not being cavalier with how I say things. So it's really my feelings are much about the same, right? Even my intuition on some of these things has really stayed the same. It's more about the language and how I'm a little more delicate with that.
Yeah. And I think that's, first of all, I think the fact that you are willing to change your opinion and correct the record is really valuable. Not everybody does that. So thank you for that. And like you said, being careful in language, I think goes a long way, and not being as dogmatic or cavalier in some of our claims, I think can be really helpful. So you mentioned nutrition. So can you talk a little bit there about how your perspectives have changed over the last few years, if they have, and kind of what you do now, how you approach nutrition? And I guess maybe before that, I'd just be interested to know, when you think about health, do you think about it more from the perspective of longevity, say, like the way Peter Attia describes, his approach to maintaining function later in life? Do you think of it more through the perspective of, optimizing functionality now? Or do you think of it some other way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I used to really think about it only from the perspective of betterment. How can I get stronger, faster, bigger, whatever, right? And that only lasts so long before you realize that it really is just a means to an end. Like, what are we trying to get out of this life? What I'm trying to get out of this life when I think about it is moment to moment, I want to be able to do the things that I love in the moment that I so choose. That's the most important thing. So that can change. That's what the beauty of it is, dynamic. Like if I decide that I want to start doing something different, then I can work towards that, and that becomes the new sort of goal, so to speak. But I'm blessed to have flexibility in my life. I would love to be able to wake up in the morning and decide that I want to go climb X mountain and be able to do it. And sometimes it's not about literally doing it. It's about knowing that I can. So that is how I sort of triangulate all of that, is how do I take this away and be able to do the things that I love? I try not to spin it negatively. Some people say, well, I don't want to run into this situation, or I don't want to be the dad that does this. I try to have a positive spin on it. No, I want to do these things. Really important. And I also want to, pull rather than push, right? I want to encourage my kids to do fun things that are active, not be like, I don't want to run into a situation where I can't go do something. That would be a lie, but I don't want to put that emphasis in my mind. I try to make it more about what I can do and what I want to do. So the nice thing about that is it's wildly scalable depending on who you are as a person when you look at it like that, because perhaps you're just someone that like maybe all you want to be able to do is walk up a couple flights of stairs without feeling fatigued that day, right? Like you want to just one step at a time. So it allows me to look at things moment to moment and think about that's how I look at health. So performance might be a part of that day, but realistically, I'm trying not to look 50 years ahead all the time, because that just narrows my scope and makes me kind of miserable. And I think if you look moment to moment, it's going to be right in front of you anyway.
Yeah. I think that's a really valuable framework. And again, maybe for some people, taking the 30-year view is a way that helps them stay motivated. And maybe for other people, that's sort of a, what do I want to be able to do today, tomorrow perspective is the most effective. Although as you're saying that, I sort of wonder, there are days where I just want to have a big plate of super nachos. So
that's a good point. That's what I've joked about with a lot of people who have said like, well, like you've been, your brand's been going for a while. Like how long you want to do this? And I'm like, yeah, I would like to just eat a pizza, that would be, that.
Do you ever eat pizza?
Of course.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And then, I mean, to kind of, you had mentioned nutrition, and I guess that kind of goes into the second thing I've really pivoted my stance on. And that's really my stance on insulin. Really. I think I'd say I have a realistic stance on insulin now, right? It's whereas 10 years ago, 7 years ago, I wouldn't ever say I demonized insulin, but I had a negativity bias in terms of my view towards it, right? Like just coming out of that low carb echo chamber, so to speak, which again, I'm a low carb dude. I'm not afraid to admit it, but there's a difference between being optimized for low carb and feeling good on it and living in that echo chamber where you're unwilling to like.
And when you say low carb, what does that mean?
For me, I am usually under 100 grams of carbs a day. I'm not ketogenic now. I do feel a little bit better with some carbs, and I feel like when I was heavier, it made more sense, and I felt great on keto. And I arguably do feel cognitively sharper when I'm in ketosis compared to when I'm just low carb. I'm in that, what I joke as metabolic purgatory. I'm kind of in the in-between low carb and moderate, and so it's like I zap through my carb source pretty quick, and it's easy to feel sluggish in that case, right? So like there's a fine line, but so cognitively maybe I'm not quite as clicked on as I was if I was keto, but what I've traded in terms of recovery is a fair bit better. So, but where I've really kind of changed my stance with that is sort of thinking that insulin was this long-term chronic enemy for me, even as someone that had already lost weight and was already now healthy and not having to really worry about that. And I don't think that insulin is a great thing to have, chronically elevated.
Sure.
But I certainly don't feel like spiking your insulin is a problem anymore, right? So that's something that I think I've just matured a lot, and being able to strategically utilize carbohydrates. My view on carbohydrates hasn't ever really changed because I was never an anti-carb person. But carbs have, at least for the last 10, 12 years, always been sort of an exogenous tool for me. If I need them for performance, I will use them, but they're not a staple for me, right? But they're also not deleterious. They're not also hindering me, right?
And do you actually measure insulin, or are you more just making this connection between when you eat carbs, you're going to spike glucose, spike insulin?
Yeah, I'd say, day to day, it's making the connection. I certainly have tested insulin before. Certainly look at that. And, rather than when I was very overweight and dealing with insulin resistance, I haven't had an issue with high insulin.
Right. Yeah. So, and I guess just to follow on the insulin piece, tell me if you disagree, but I think probably more important than insulin levels itself is insulin sensitivity and making sure that you aren't going down the path to insulin resistance. That fit with the way you think about it?
For sure. In fact, I think that an acute spike in insulin is a rather nice thing, if it comes back down and does what it's supposed to do, and it's when you've got bell curve on top of bell curve on top of bell, and you're chronically high. That's a whole different ballgame. I would rather, and sometimes I catch flack for this in some ways, like as a healthy, active person, I kind of like the idea of having something moderate glycemic, moderately high glycemic, so I can actually have that spike and come back down and control it, because I try to manage those things. So it's a little bit different for someone that's performance-based, right? Like you look at someone that's, exercising, they might have a hit of maltodextrin to get there, right? So it's just, that's not me. I'm not an elite level athlete, but I do try to view it.
You're pretty elite.
I'm not elite from a competitive sense. I just elite in my own.
You put us through a workout before we recorded today, so
I just try to just keep up with my kids.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So I mean, it sounds like though you don't favor like a really dogmatic approach to nutrition. You said you're not keto. What do you think about? Well, first of all, I guess one question would be, we talked about carbs. Where are you at with protein? And I mean, to the extent you're willing to share, like what does your typical day look like?
Totally. I'd say, I wake up, I would say 6 out of 7 days I train I don't train 7 days a week, but I'm saying 6 out of 7 days that I would be training, I'd be training fasted. Maybe 5 out of 7. I usually like to train fasted. I prefer it. So almost always it's some kind of workout in a fasted state. However, recently I've been utilizing like some cyclic dextrin a couple days a week and trying to just get some fast absorbing carb and a little whey protein in before I train. Just because I'm like, maybe I'll try it, and maybe I'll counterbalance some of, what I've been training fasted for so long. Maybe there's I don't want to make myself glucose intolerant when I do train, because I was finding when I would add carbs in when I would train, I would actually feel sluggish. And I'm like, maybe I'm just inefficient at these, and not to go off on a tangent, but when I did my VO2 max with Andy Galpin, it was like, I didn't really cross a 1 RER until I was in the recovery phase. So it was Andy that told me, he's like, you're pretty carb intolerant. You may actually benefit from like occasionally dipping your toe in the water so that he's like, because you probably increase your performance a little bit just by showing what you're technically leaving on the table here. Right. You're not crossing that 1 RER until you're at your VO2 max. That's impressive that you can do that. But there's a difference between that's impressive you can do that and, hey, dude, you got more. Right. So again, it's not saying that carbs are the only way by all means, but I mean, sometimes to get that extra few percent, it matters. So when it comes back to kind of that whole equation, I started going on a tangent. I don't know where I was going before. But
we were talking about so I asked about protein, and then also kind of what does your typical day look like? And again, it's going to vary from day to day, but
adding like some cyclic dextrin in, just try to mess around with that. Yeah. Usually I wait about an hour to 2 hours after I train to have something to eat, just because I feel like there's a little bit of an afterburn effect. I might as well milk it for a little bit. And I'm usually not that hungry right after my workout.
And you start sort of let yourself be guided by your body, how you feel?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And there's a lot of randomness to my timing. I really don't have any specific period of time between meals. I eat at all kind of random hours of the day. The only meal that is really set in stone with the time that I eat is usually like eating dinner between 5 and 6 p.m. That's the one meal that I feel like even for my circadian cues, I feel like that's a good meal to have kind of rooted. The other ones kind of move around.
Got it.
I would say most days I'm eating after about 12 to 14 hours from my previous meal, from dinner to breakfast. So it's not a deliberate intermittent fasting. It's just kind of the way it ends up happening. Like if I stop eating at 6 and I train early in the morning, and I might eat at 8 a.m. or eat at 9 a.m., right? So I'm like getting a decent length fast, even though I don't really consider that a fast. I just consider that life.
Right. And I mean, you were a pretty big proponent of intermittent fasting, maybe still are. Be interested to hear about that. But I mean, you also did longer fasts. And so for you, that doesn't probably, like you said, probably doesn't even feel like a time-restricted eating. No, it's just what you've adapted to.
Totally. It feels normal. In fact, if I eat earlier than that, it feels kind of weird.
Yeah.
So my body's adapted to that. Usually breakfast is, post-workout, I might have a whey protein shake and then wait a little bit longer and have something a little bit more substantial. So it's usually like 3 whole eggs and probably about 3/4 of a cup to a cup of egg whites additionally. So a little extra protein on top. Whereas previously it would have just been all eggs. I just don't see the need for me to have 7 or 8 full eggs if I don't need to. So along with that, maybe a little bit of asparagus in the morning along with the eggs kind of mixed in.
I'm
Usually
getting hungry.
berries, pretty basic. I mean, a lot of times I'll mix some, goat cheese or smoked salmon or something in there too. It kind of all depends on where I want my fats for that day. But breakfast is usually pretty basic. And then a couple hours later, usually like a pound of ground beef kind of in one meal, maybe a little bit of avocado. Again, might be a little bit of fruit along with it. Depending on how lean the beef is. I'm not a big fan of mixing high or even moderate amounts of fat and carbs. I just feel like that seems like, from a substrate utilization standpoint, it seems like it would be kind of difficult, but it also seems like that's really a recipe for the standard American diet anyway. That's like where the problem is. Like I have feelings on it. I know that there's reason to believe that, yes, some fats might attenuate the glycemic index. Sure, I get that, but I also feel like having those in tandem is not really the best thing. So if I'm having lean beef, like 96% lean beef or something like that, I have no problem maybe like having a few big swigs of honey or a couple tablespoons of honey. And really for me, it's convenience. I mean, I feel like honey is a way for me to get my carb count where I need it without having to load down my digestive system. Because if I have a sweet potato at lunch, I'm kind of gassy by like 6 p.m. or something like that. I just don't really like it, and I don't like feeling heavy. I like a lower volume of food there. Chomp sticks are kind of a staple throughout the day. I mean, I just kind of eat stuff like that, just getting that lean protein, hard-boiled eggs. My diet's pretty boring. It's not that fun. But dinner, I do try to relax. I want to be part of the family. And I think our family really adheres to a particular style of eating generally anyway. So it's usually a protein, a veggie, some kind of butternut squash or a sweet potato or, some kind of healthy starch. So it's not this earth-shattering diet. I mean, I could get into the granulars of like specific foods that I do like, and then if I could like have the perfect day, what it would look like. But when it's like Thomas's day in the life, it's not anything exciting.
Yeah. Well, and I do think it's important too that you said you have dinner with your family. And I mean, again, that human connection is a really important part of health, right? And so that you make time to do that and do that, I think is super valuable.
Totally.
So how much protein do you typically end up with in a day?
I'm 185 pounds, so I usually strive for 180 to 200 grams of protein, which is a lot. It's not that much, but it's, that obviously makes up the lion's share of my diet. And I would be lying if I said that, some of that didn't come from whey protein. I usually have 2 shakes a day to get that up there. So it doesn't have to be a ton of food. It's not that hard to get there. But, some days when you forget to eat breakfast or you skip it and
I wouldn't know about that. I never forget to eat a meal.
If we just worked out, I was like, I forgot to eat. I usually do. I mean, it's funny how quickly you acclimate, right? Like, and body composition hasn't changed. Like, I've done less fasting and then starting to eat more in the way of breakfast. And then all of a sudden you start finding like, okay, well, I'm eating more calories, but I'm not gaining weight, and then you start getting hungry at 10 a.m. So 10 a.m. rolls around. I'm like, oh, shoot, I could eat.
Yeah. So you mentioned body composition. What is your body composition right now?
I'd say right now, probably 7% body fat. I usually hover between 6 and 7.
Yeah. Wow. And you've been there for a while, right?
Yeah. I'd say I've definitely been sub 10 for probably the last 10 years, probably sub 8 for really the last like 7 years or so.
Yeah. And I mean, what do you say to people who say that, being that lean is not healthy?
I think that the body is highly resilient and adapts. And I think, when you're talking 7-8%, you're talking still within a decent range. And as long as you're not putting yourself in any kind of like psychological or emotional distress to be there,
right?
I think 7 or 8% is, although maybe not always achievable or attainable for everybody, it's not an unhealthy body fat percentage. I've definitely been at an unhealthy body fat percentage, sitting at like 4 or 5% for extended periods of time for photo shoots and that kind of thing. Yeah, it definitely plays a role. But I think there's a lot more than meets the eye with it. I think there's genetics. I think there's a lot of things like where
it's going to be somewhat individual for sure.
I've hung at this body fat for so long. I think my body's relatively comfortable there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I tend to kind of balance out and reside around 8%.
And what's your daily caloric intake?
Not too much. I'd probably say about 2,500 calories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So that's diet. Exercise. So I got to see what at least a light workout for you looks like today. What does your typical exercise regimen look like throughout the week?
I would say that was a moderate to intense workout. That wasn't a light. So that was moderate with some intense flares in there, definitely.
Good, because I'm going to feel it tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, that brings me to, some things that I've changed. If we kind of go to the third thing that I've changed over years, my training has definitely changed because I went from being very deliberate strength training and very deliberate cardio. Like it was very segmented. And then I realized that work capacity plays a part, right? And there was a direct correlation with me doing the kind of training that we did today, which is a little more HIIT-based. I would almost call it, it's CrossFit-y, but I don't subscribe to the typical CrossFit notion. I just like the idea of metabolic conditioning and those kinds of, I do think that something comes in when you start talking about that hybridized type training in one session, when you're really working that work capacity, you're actually working strength and is it counterintuitive for hypertrophy? Yes. Is it deleterious to hypertrophy? No, but you may not get as much growth on those days, but as long as you do have the deliberate days. So that kind of training has become a big part of my life. And it came into my life just by necessity after having kids, right? It was like, I still wanted to get my heart rate up. I still wanted to get strength training. And I only had 30 minutes or 45 minutes. How do I do it? So I went all the way that way and started training like that, drinking the CrossFit Kool-Aid for a while. I really liked the results, but the CNS load was just too much. I was just taxing my nervous system all the time with this high intensity training. So then I realized like, okay, I have to be okay with maybe doing those kinds of workouts twice a week. And then maybe 2 days a week doing dedicated full body resistance training. We're focusing on the compound moves and no cardio around those workouts, right? Those workouts are dedicated for strength. If I do cardio, it might be later in the day, completely detached from when I did my strength training. I put the blinders on and focus on, the big kind of.
And do you just sort of play it by feel, whether you do cardio later in the day, or are you regimented, like this is what I'm going to do this week?
I'm not regimented at all with my cardio. I love cardio, and it doesn't take regimen for me to do cardio. I think my default is I want to do it, and it sometimes takes my wife being like, "Hey, you're going to overdo it. Don't go do it.
Yeah.
You're old now. Like don't, And it's so like I want to, so I never have to write it into my programming because left to my own devices, I will want to go for a run. I will want to do those kinds of things and be outside and. It's sometimes problematic because I sometimes don't feel like I'm getting a good workout unless my heart rate is high, and that's not the case, right? That doesn't, And I guess that's almost the thing I've had to change is like, really learning that not every workout needs to be this banger spiker heart rate. Like there's something about parasympathetic activation, and I really divide my training up now, no matter what it is, where I usually have high stress load. The next day, try to be more parasympathetic, even if it's in my training, right? So it might be more like a HIIT training type today, definitely sympathetic tone to that. So tomorrow would probably be just maybe a slow jog, a zone 2 type training, where for me, that would be more parasympathetic. I mean, it's casual. I'm not going to go 30 miles. I might run, 5 or 6 miles at a very slow pace.
Right. And I mean, I think, this idea of overtraining, I think, especially in like the performance space, a lot of people overtrain. How do you just go by feel or how do you assess if you're like, okay, I really need to back off a little bit and not go do that 10-mile run?
Yeah, I need to, I do have to listen to my allosteric or allostatic. I always get this confused. Allosteric, right? My allosteric load, like sort of like what else is going on in my life, right?
Sure.
Like, so it's not all black and white, like what's on paper, and that's, it's a huge thing that I've had to learn is that if you have a stressful event going on the day before or something happens that's stressing you out or relationship issues or issues with your kids, these things, or poor sleep, like I'll be damned that doesn't make a huge impact.
Absolutely.
So it's always subject to change. So I do very much so go based on feel, and that sometimes can derail what I want to do.
Okay.
Right? Like if I did a bunch of deadlifts yesterday and my plan was to do HIIT today, but for whatever reason, I'm extra taxed from the deadlifts and my hamstrings are way more tight than they normally are after a deadlift day. Obviously, it's going to change the scope of what I do, right? So you have to be and you have to be okay with that. That's the thing, is like not get frustrated about that and realize that tomorrow's another day and there's something else that you can do. So highly, dynamic with how I shuffle it.
Do you use any wearables or trackers? And what do you think about using wearables for people who maybe aren't quite as attuned as you are to their bodies as a tool for assessing, should I take a break? Should I do a little bit less today?
Yeah, I think that the wearables can be a great way to get a snapshot of certain things. But I think once you start living and dying by them, you're losing touch with the feel.
Yeah.
Because I think that these are measuring X number of biometrics. Okay, that's great. But how many other hundreds of thousands biometrics is our body fielding that it's not articulating into a device?
Right.
So I haven't charged my Whoop in
But you still wear it.
It was a Father's Day present from my wife. And if you're,
I don't want to get you in trouble. You can stop right there.
Point is, she knows, she
Okay.
knows too. I joke about it because it's like, no, it's a gift from the family. And like, even though like because the data from it is too much for me sometimes, where like I wake up and I feel good and my RPE or my like rating of recovery that I would give myself might be a 9. And then this thing tells me that I'm a 4. And I'm like, that just doesn't make sense. And there's other days where I'm wrecked. And if my Whoop's like, take on your day. And I'm like, taking on the day for me is like, just getting my ass in the car, because I'm beat. So it's like, you don't know me, it's like, so the point is that if I were to extrapolate all the data, I would say most of the time it's right? Most of the time it's fairly in line, but there's a lot of times when it's not too. I'd say 6 out of 10 times it tells me like what I need. But it's a really cool thing. Like it's fun. And I think from the sake of like motivation for people, like and having people to see that, I think it really helps a ton. And there's a lot that you can get. And I wear an Aura too. And when I have them both charged, I do cross-reference. And a lot of times they're in line. But then I'd say about 30% of the time they're not in line, where the Whoop will read one recovery score really high and the Aura will read low. And I started to find like, okay, Aura was really good for sleep. Aura was really good at monitoring sleep. And the Whoop was much better at real-time like HRV and things like that. So I'm like, okay, it makes sense to wear both.
Right. And it's not always obvious how these readiness scores are calculated, right? And so those are going to be combinations of multiple things that are being measured. But I think the take home from you is pay attention to your body. And if you're getting different signals from your wearable and your body, probably listen to your body.
Well, and and then I wear a Garmin too, right? And my Garmin's lens in which it views me is heavily skewed by whether or not I'm running. Because Garmin is a running device. So it's like right now it says I'm unproductive. And I joke about that. I'm like, jerk. Like you don't like, I'm very productive. And like so it tells me these things, but I'm like, your lens of me, your view of me is skewed on whether I'm running or not. So it's like, it's looking like, well, you haven't logged a run today. I'm like, yeah, but you do what I just did, Garmin. Like
I can guarantee, Garmin, that you have not been unproductive this morning. Okay, so covered nutrition, exercise, mentioned sleep. So, what do you do? Do you do anything for sleep quality? You wear an Aura, or you have in the past. What are your sort of approaches there?
Yeah. I've always prioritized sleep, but if we focus on like where I've changed, the big thing that I've changed is my wife and I frequently sleep divorce. We sleep in the same bed a lot, but then we're also not afraid to go sleep in another bed. Like it doesn't mean that we're divorcing. We've been together 20 years. I can go, so I'd say the big thing is we prioritize our waking hours as a relationship, not our sleeping hours together, because who cares, right? So if I go in another bedroom and sleep because I really need to get sleep, and there's been numerous sleep doctors that have talked about this. I mean, the amount of times you are woken up by your spouse is very high. It's probably the biggest factor waking you up. So for me, it's like that's the biggest thing is coming to terms and being okay with that.
Right.
And our relationship has only been better when we both sleep. So sleep divorce has been a big thing, but I've always prioritized sleep. But I'd say what I do now that's different is I do have a fairly strict like sleep supplement routine that I follow. I take 500 milligrams magnesium, dimagnesium malate. I take 400 to 600 milligrams theanine, 1,000 milligrams tryptophan. And sometimes I've been toying around with taking saffron too. Saffron seems to help quite a bit. There's a number of different saffron supplements that are out there. So that's kind of the big ones for me. And that makes quite a big difference for my sleep.
And have you noticed if like you're traveling and you forget the supplements or something, that there's a degradation in sleep quality right away, or does it seem to be okay if you miss a few days?
Usually okay. I usually sleep like crap the first 1 or 2 days traveling anyway. It doesn't matter what supplements I'm taking. And if I'm not a big melatonin guy, I will use like a 0.5 milligram if I'm changing time zones, just because I feel like that's a practical use case for it. And if I need to knock myself out, a lot of times, like if I'm traveling, it's somewhere pretty quick turnaround where I need to fly somewhere, film the next morning or something and come back.
Right.
So it's pretty imperative. If I'm going to the East Coast or something like that, I'm like, no, I got to get to sleep on time. So I will knock myself out, but I know that it's not the same as if I'm on that proper cue.
Right. Yeah. So we've talked about, so at Optispan, we kind of think about four pillars, right? Eat, move, sleep, we've talked about. The fourth one we think about is connect. And we sort of put both, connection to yourself, mindfulness, and also human relationships under that pillar. So I'm wondering, do you do anything intentional around either of those? And if so, like what are your strategies, thoughts in those areas?
I mean, that's the whole connection and emotional health piece has been like tremendous for me the last year.
Great.
right? Like that was the big piece that was missing. Like I talk about how I've talked about publicly how my immune system was trashed and all these things. And quite frankly, as woo-woo as it sounds, like dealing with emotional stuff and that connection has miraculously solved that problem. And I feel like that's when I look at all these different things that I've done, there's peptides I've done and this and that. I'm like, no, the big low hanging fruit here, the biggest lever that I pulled was coming to grips with like true connection and emotional health. And I would put emotional health and connection in the same bucket for this
Sure.
case. I mean, I'm sure there's definitely different buckets for the case of this. You know, my family is extremely, extremely important to me. So I find that when I'm not connected with them in the sense where I'm feeling guilty or feeling this and that, because I'm not actually taking the true dedicated time. I spend a lot of time with my family, but quality over quantity, for sure. And even if I'm at work or just however, the guilt will destroy you otherwise, right? So it's much better for me to just be 100% present when I can be present. You know, I'm also not ashamed of, you know, I've done a lot of like emotional trauma work with ketamine and things like that over the last year, and it's made the biggest difference in the world for me.
Interesting.
And whether it's the ketamine or whether it's the therapy that's gone with it, who knows? Bottom line is like being able to connect with yourself and understand yourself a little bit more, occasionally detach from yourself and realize that there's a bigger picture out there. And, you know, so those kinds of things have probably made the biggest difference in my recovery. I can't say they've made a difference in like performance for this or that, but my recovery, my ability to wake up each day like charged and ready to go in the way that I want to be has definitely improved with that. And I realized that what I've learned about myself is how much, although I love spending as much time with my family as possible, how I thoroughly recharge is with solitude. Right. And I've learned that about myself. And I feel like if people can kind of uncover these things about themselves that maybe society leads us to believe that we shouldn't have, like as a man, I was like, oh, well, what kind of father am I if I take time for myself?
Yeah, right.
You know, my workouts are the time for myself. No, my workout's my job now, unfortunately. Like I love working out, but once it has the label of part of who you are as a brand, it does.
Yeah.
So like, how do I recharge? I might need to just go for a 2-hour hike by myself and just be alone. Right.
That's great.
And so that's been a big thing for me.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would put as like another important pillar or factor in your routine health approach to healthiness that that you think is important to mention?
I think that, well, it's not an important pillar, but one thing I was going to put under nutrition is that I didn't mention is, you know, my stance on fructose. That's one that I had made like a pretty strong stance on before. Okay. And I realized that like, yeah, in a metabolically unhealthy person, fructose could be problematic, but for a healthy person, you deal with fructose just fine. So touch on that for just a second. So sure. That's one, because like my fruit consumption is pretty dang high. My honey consumption is, relatively speaking, it's not high, but you know, that's the majority of my carbs are coming probably from honey and fruit anyway. Yeah.
And so in the past, you'd been sort of negative on the idea.
I think that's probably the one that if I could get myself into trouble with the most in terms of how I took a pretty strong stance, was probably that surrounding fructose.
It's okay. I get crap from people because I joked once that bananas are Snickers bar. No, let's see. Yeah, bananas are a Snickers bar masquerading as fruit or something like that, right? So
I mean, I do agree with you though that like out of all the fruit, bananas are pretty low. You know what I mean? Not a lot of polyphenols, not a lot of like you know, at least with berries, apples, and things like that, the polyphenol count kind of bananas don't offer much.
Right, right, exactly. But I mean, I think also you said if you're diabetic or metabolically compromised, they can be a problem, and you know the unfortunate fact is like 60% of Americans are obese or have diabetes. And so being thoughtful about what fruits you eat and when you eat them is important probably for a significant fraction of the population. Fruits are good and bad. Yep. And it really depends on your unique situation.
Exactly. Yeah. And the quantity, I mean, it's just, and how you're getting it. I mean, high fructose corn syrup is very different. Sure. You know? So I mean, just in terms of the sheer quantity that you can get in.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think of anything else. I mean, in terms of supplements, you know, some of my perspective has changed with like they're a little more nuancy things, right? Like I kind of go back to the basics with supplements rather than getting
what is your supplement? So you talked about what you do for sleep already. Yeah. Beyond that, what is sort of your
beyond that? It's pretty basic. I mean, obviously whey protein, creatine. I am definitely very bullish on, but I found that for me to make the juice worth the squeeze with creatine, I might get in trouble for saying like 10 to 15 grams is really where I benefit. Maybe that's just because I have a larger muscle mass. Maybe I
Yeah.
just need more. 5 grams, I actually find like I just retain some water and don't get a huge benefit out of it.
And how do you know if you're getting a benefit?
I can feel it. I mean, that's like tremendous difference in just, and for me, I think a lot of it is because I'm pretty low carb, it's the intracellular water that I get from creatine that I don't otherwise have from carbohydrate stores.
Okay.
So I think just that internal leverage, because I mean, I just feel it. I feel like the actual like contractile like strength is stronger.
Got it.
I'm physically stronger, but I can feel it. I've been training long enough to really feel when that internal leverage is just different.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like if you wear a weight belt and you create that internal pressure, you feel stronger in your core because you've got that you've got that fluid ball that you've created against a weight belt. Everyone can tell you that if they wear a weight belt, they feel a little bit stronger because you get to push against that weight belt. The same thing is kind of true with your muscles when you have that, more water volume in your muscle in the right way. And I find like probably because I don't eat a whole lot of carbohydrates, my muscle stores are probably not ever super full. And 5 grams of creatine probably just isn't enough. But when I get to 10, 15, it's like, okay, now the extra water retention that I don't necessarily like to have for being on camera or photos is worth it because I'm actually able to volumize this muscle through heavy training. Become a big fan of TMG. I really think betaine, trimethylglycine is especially as an antioxidant, which is really where it seems like, in particular with training, that's where the evidence is really strong. So I found big improvement with that. Always been a big magnesium guy. Other than that, those are really the staples. I mean, I definitely mess around with other little things and have some fun with it and stuff like that, and different peptides and things like that. And I try to look at it through the lens of that's fun. What can I do? What little levers can I pull and try to get a little more performance? But the big staples are basics.
Yeah, I would agree with you on supplements too. Mine is pretty short as well. It's interesting because, you hear about these people who are taking 100+ supplements, but then when you actually talk to the people who are knowledgeable and often successful, they don't have that huge stack. So can we finish up real quickly with peptides? Because since you brought it up, this really interesting topic, lots and lots of people are interested to hear sort of your experience with peptides and kind of how you navigate, the sort of intriguing information that's out there, but also in many cases, lack of a real large body of evidence, right, to support efficacy with these peptides.
Yeah. I think with the peptide world, it's largely anecdotal and it's spreading like wildfire. There is something to be said with anecdote, though. Obviously, people are having, at least seemingly having effects from it. My personal experience with it, I'm not going to just take something usually willy-nilly if it's like a mystery compound, but with things like BPC and TP500, there's literature that's been around, at least in rodents, for a long enough time. So at least for me to risk reward, say, okay, the safety profile is probably fine. And I've also done Pernuvo scans and Ezra scans and make sure I don't have any like tumors.
Sure.
And that's usually like, if resources would allow you to do that, that would be my recommendation. I'm like, before, there's a lot of, growth hormone analogs and all kinds of different things that are out there, which I think have promise, but if you can afford it, go get a full body MRI scan before you go hop on something like that.
And maybe in general, even if you're not going to do peptides, it's not a bad idea. But
agreed, 100%. But anytime you're talking about angiogenesis and you're talking about like especially with BPC, like if you did have something growing, there's a good chance it could exacerbate it. So why take that risk? So that was one of the things, like the prerequisite for me was before I did any kind of BPC or anything like that, I wanted to do one of those scans and kind of make sure, because I wouldn't have touched it otherwise.
Got it.
Probably would have been doing some other things if I saw something.
Right.
But so it's difficult because I don't know if we're going to see any like human trials on this anytime soon.
Unfortunately, I think that's the challenge right now, right? Yeah.
And so you do take a little bit of a risk. However, these are things that I don't think are designed to be taken long-term anyway. And so my own personal opinion is like with BPC 157, I'm down to do a couple rounds a year of it, and just use it in 3 to 5 week sprints, but really only use it as needed. I've definitely toyed around with like Ipamorelin and CJC. I took tesamorelin, but that one like made my blood sugar do some wonky things.
Really?
Yeah.
Were you wearing a CGM? Is that how you knew?
No, but I could just tell. I
feel it.
Yeah, you flush and get those feelings. And that's a known side effect of it.
Right.
And also then it was affecting my sleep. And I'm like, okay, this is pretty telltale.
Yeah.
And with tesamorelin, that's like the most common thing. The CJC, the Ipamorelin, definitely helped my sleep. But it's one of those things where I can't get it out of my mind that there's nothing in life comes for free. Like you can't borrow from tomorrow for today. Like you're going to be, or you can, but you're going to borrow from tomorrow. So I'm just like, okay, yes, this is triggering a growth hormone pulse, but what's the catch? Like, that's
Yeah.
why I always ask myself, maybe it's cynical, but there's always got to be a little bit of a catch. So I try to look at these things with like, I mean, even with rapamycin, right? Like, it's like there's a little bit of a catch, right? So, and it doesn't mean that the cost benefit is going to not be in your favor, but I want to know, right? And I think that's the main reason you look at safety profiles is you just want to know, is it worth the squeeze? So with the like GHRPs and things like that, we just don't know. So it's not something that I'm willing to do for long periods of time. I'm just finishing up a round of CJC and ipamorelin, and my recovery's been great. My ability to like turn around and train has been nothing like it's been in 10 years. So, I mean, anecdotally, yeah. But also it's helped me sleep a lot. So is it coming from the growth hormone, or is it coming from the actual sleep that's coming as a result of it?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I mean, we chatted just briefly about this off camera, but just yesterday interviewed Greg Fahey, who works on thymic regeneration. And again, that's a place where he's pretty sure that the growth hormone treatment can actually improve thymic function in adults and potentially improve immune function. So again, there's some biology there that suggests there could be some benefits, and you want to be aware of the risks.
Yeah.
So,
but that's also just, that's in isolation in one kind of myopic lens, right? So it's
absolutely
like so many things. The nice thing about growth hormone in general, I haven't messed around with actual growth hormone, but I mean, that's a pretty universal hormone for a lot of things. Right. So, even though you could be looking at it through one lens of thymus, there's also a lot of other things that it could be doing. So.
Yeah, we'll finish up with this, but I find it interesting. I'm interested to get your perspective how sometimes like growth hormone, and I'm certainly not suggesting people should go out and start taking growth hormone, but things like growth hormone, I think the peptides to some extent, kind of get demonized a bit. And again, there may be real risks associated with these things for sure. Like growth hormone, people will say there's this big cancer risk. You talked about going and getting an MRI first. And so they sort of get that reputation for causing cancer, even though there's not a lot of data to show that they cause cancer. It's a concern. It's something we'll be aware of. But sometimes molecules in the absence of data can get, talked about as if they have these crazy benefits, but it also goes the other direction. Sure. Sometimes they get demonized. And, I think as you alluded to with the peptides, it seems unlikely we're going to get the clinical trial data anytime soon. So you have to kind of find a good doc and do your own risk reward analysis. And I assume you've got a good doc helping you with this.
Sometimes, you look at things like this and you're like, okay, well, it might not get the attention that it deserves. And sometimes that's how you know it works.
Yeah, maybe. Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. And I've had a great time.
Cool. Thanks, man.